That's the one thing that no other worldview can answer. That question. What is the purpose of life? Why are we here? What are we doing here? What are we here for? It doesn't make any sense. Without a Judeo-Christian worldview, you can't answer those questions. There's no purpose for us here. But with God, he makes everything make sense. With God, he gives purpose to each one of us. He gives intrinsic value and worth to each one of us. That's why it cracks me up so much, these movements that like the feminist movement or other movements like that want to like empower people, and yet they're doing it separate from God. It's like, well, God is the only one that gives people intrinsic value and worth. So if you separate people from God, they no longer have intrinsic value and worth. It's like those videos that you see of this. Remember a couple years back when people were like, defund the police, and they're having these big riots and stuff like that. And then some crazy thing would happen in the riot and people would get hurt, and they would be calling for the police. Like, somebody call the police, It's like, you're at a defund the police event here, and yet you're calling for the police. It doesn't make sense. Without God, these things do you no good. You have no empowerment without God. You have no value. You have no worth. And yet with God, you have all those things and even more, because you know that he has an eternal plan for your life. You know that he wants to do with you something that you can't do with yourself. He wants to fulfill your soul. How can he do that? In verse 6, Paul says, "For I'm already being poured out as a drink offering, and the time of my departure has come." Let me tell you what a drink offering is. Okay, so in the law of Moses, a drink offering was commanded. It was a sacrifice to God. You know how they would sacrifice like bulls and goats and things of that nature? Like they had animal sacrifices, but they also had sacrifices of like agriculture, food. Okay, so they would give wheat, they would give barley, they would give olive oil. They had all these things. And any sacrifice from man's perspective is a waste, because even when they were sacrificing an animal, they would give the portion that was God's, and they would put it on an altar, and they would light it on fire, and they would burn it until there's nothing left. So it's a waste from man's perspective. Man can't do anything with that. It's completely gone. You can't eat it anymore. It's not of any value to you. And yet the point was that you're supposed to trust God. You're giving it to him. There's a ton of imagery here, but you're giving a sacrifice to God and telling him, God, I trust you for my sustenance. I trust you even though I'm giving away something that I could eat, giving away something that would sustain me. I trust you that you're going to provide for me beyond that. And so they would give these sacrifices as a sacrifice to them. They were sacrificing the things of themselves to give to God. And a drink offering, I think, is one of the most special things, because it's a true waste. This is how a drink offering would go. Okay? They would take wine and they would pour it in a big jug. And all they would do is they would raise that jug up like this, and they would dump it out on the ground in front of them. That was the sacrifice. That's it. They didn't burn it. They didn't do nothing else to it. They just lifted it up and they dumped it out in front of them. But it was to show, God, we're making this sacrifice to you that we trust you. We trust you with everything. That was the point. It's with animals. It's with their agriculture. It's with wine. It's with everything. Everything that they counted on for their sustenance, they sacrificed to the Lord to show him that they trusted in him. It's the same thing we do today, because they had this connection with these things. They're living in an agricultural society. So everyone had animals. Well, I shouldn't say everyone, but the majority of people, even the priests, raised animals. They raised agriculture. They had all these things from the time that they were very small until they grew them up and got bigger until they were ready for the sacrifice. And so they're directly connected. Can you imagine having an animal from the time it was a little baby, seeing the birth of this animal, and then growing it up and raising it just to sacrifice it to God, just to kill it? That's what they did. Yeah, just that twinge that you felt in your heart for this animal, that's what they felt too, but even greater. But it was showing the Lord how much they trusted him. So they had this direct connection to the sacrifice. It's the same thing we do today in an offering. When we make an offering to the Lord, we work today. We're not in what I would consider an agricultural society. We go and work for money. And so when we sacrifice that to God, he honors it because we're saying, God, I'm going to lay this down at your feet, knowing that you're going to sustain me, even though I'm giving something away and wasting it. And yet, God uses that. He uses your faith to bless you. He uses your faith in him to sustain you. Because you all know that God is your sustenance, right? It's not your job. It's not your boss. It's not your clients. It's not the money. Those things won't sustain you. They don't care about you. It's God that's your provider. It's God that puts those things in your life in order to sustain you. Okay? So we have this direct connection to sacrifice as well. So Paul is saying, even though it looks from man's perspective like my life is just a waste, because yeah, I've gone around and I've preached the gospel. I gave up everything. You know, Paul was a Pharisee, which is the prominent organization that was the leaders, the governmental leaders of the Jews at that time. He was raised into it, which means he was going to be part of the government. And with the government, just like our government, that comes pride and prestige and fame and money and all those things. And he had that opportunity. And yet he gave all that up to serve the Lord. He truly laid his life down in everything that he could have had. All that pride and prestige and money and fame and all those things, he laid it down in order to come out of that to serve the Lord. And so Paul is saying, my life to some people looked like a waste. I'm sure to the other Pharisees and the people that raised him up and taught him the scriptures, they're like, oh man, what a waste. Because here he was doing these great things and we were raising him up to be in government, and then he just walked away from it all. It's a waste. But Paul says, in the midst of all that, I have found what life is really all about. Even though my life looks like a waste, even though it looks like it was just poured out on the ground to be good for nothing, God has used it to do amazing, amazing things. Think about it. Paul spent a lot of his time after he started preaching, going from place to place, planting churches. He started being persecuted heavily. He spent a lot of time in prison. And I'm sure even to him, he was like, Lord, what are you doing? Why am I sitting here in prison when I could be out preaching the gospel? You're wasting my life. You're wasting my time. And yet it's because he was in prison that he was able to write all these epistles that we're reading now. If God hadn't put him in prison, he probably never would have wrote these things. You'll see even at the end of 2 Timothy, he says, I'm pretty much stuck here. That's why I'm writing to you. If he hadn't have been in prison, he wouldn't have been stuck there. So God used his life, even though it looked like a waste to everyone else, God used his life as a drink offering. One of my favorite stories in all the Bible is when David gave a drink offering. King David gave a drink offering to the Lord. This is what happened. The Philistines overtook Bethlehem and they captured it and they were occupying it. And David was with his men in a stronghold overlooking the city. And David's looking down at the city under Philistine occupation. And he just happens to blurt out, I think unwittingly, man, if I just could have a drink of water from the well of Bethlehem, the one by the city gate. Well, a few of his mighty men heard him say this. So they decide, hey, we're going to go down and get him a drink of water from the well. So they go down, they break through the lines of the Philistines, they go to the well, they get water, and they bring it back up to David. And they present it to him. And I'm sure they were all proud. Like, look at what we just did for our king. We risked our lives to go and get him just a drink of water. And David, seeing what they had just done for him and realizing what had happened, basically says to them, I'm not worthy of this. Why would I be worthy to drink the water of which men could have died for? He said, there's only one person who's worthy to drink this water. And at that moment, he raised it up and he poured it out on the ground. Wow, what a powerful moment. I mean, I can't imagine what the guys felt that went and risked their lives to get it, right? I bet that you're there like, oh man. But you see what a beautiful thing David did for the Lord. Because truly, there's only one person who is worth you laying down your life for. David understood that. And even though his mighty men were willing to lay down their lives for him, he said, I'm not worthy of that. Only God is worthy for a person to lay down their life for him. In that moment, he did a beautiful thing by pouring all that out, showing his unworthiness and God's worthiness. So when Paul says, I'm being poured out as a drink offering, he's saying my life has been poured out before the Lord. Because there's only one person out there who is worthy to have my life poured out for. No, it's not David. It's not Abraham. It's not any of the patriarchs. It's only God. In the same way, your life has only one person who is worthy for you to lay it down for. And that is for God himself.